Hello, puppies and kittens. I've been making a number of videos and social media posts and such, where I ask for evidence, reasons that people believe what they do. I ask for actual factual evidence and logically valid arguments. And in all the videos that I post, making these kinds of challenges, you check the comments, and there's never anything there. Well, I recently saw what I think is probably the longest, most comprehensive, and hands down best list of evidences for the Bible, and it is this. Okay, that's it, is it? Well, I'm joined by biblical historian Lorence Yufa, who is a co-host on the Blasphemer's Bible, and we're going to talk about some of these claims as evidence for the truth of the Bible. And
good idea,
Lorence. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for being on.
No problem.
I have kind of a thought on the history of the Bible and the evidence of the Bible. It occurs to me that the stories in the Bible fall into like four categories based on their age. Like you have the Genesis creation myth, which is apparently seemingly largely inspired by Mesopotamian folklore and perhaps some other influences, but it's entirely mythological. There's not even it's metaphorical, but there's not even a kernel of truth to it beyond that. And then you've got a second category where you have these legends that are based on like the Tower of Babel, which is like loosely based on the Marduk ziggurat, and you've got the Noah's Ark flood, which of course is based on the flood of Shuruppak. Because when you find that like the half a dozen oldest accounts of the flood, they're all talking about Ubar-Tutu, or they name Shuruppak, or they name Ziusudra, or they say the son of Ubar-Tutu. So we know that they're all talking about the same event, but there's virtually nothing else from the original story, right? So I mean, we know that the Tower of Babel didn't happen. We know that Noah's flood didn't happen, but we know that both of them are extreme embellishments or exaggerations on something that did happen. And perhaps Sodom and Gomorrah falls into that same kind of legendary category. Something happened to some place where some people lived, and they find this one location, and they think that, hey, this fits the destruction described in the Bible, so maybe we'll just call that Sodom and Gomorrah. And then there's another category where you start to add in, like, it was more recent. So you're not just talking about things that, like, cultural memory that you remember from, or that have been carried down from word of mouth for centuries, literally centuries. Now you're talking about things that are more recent in history. So you're going to be talking about people and places that actually existed. You're going to create a setting of a story, and you have some, again, they're legendary tales. They're tales that we wouldn't necessarily believe, but they're in real settings, like a proper story should be. And then the fourth category, which would be like in the New Testament stuff, where all the settings, the people are all real, and the settings are all real, and for the people of the time, these were actually current events, and some of it may even have actually happened, but they're all centered around a character that is at best a cult leader, and on whom the information that we have on the actual details of his life, we know that there's too many stories to be talking about just one guy. We've got like too many gospels, and they're all talking, they're saying conflicting things. There's a number of things that are shared, like the Jesus story seems to be told about a whole bunch of different people, and some of the stuff that's in there, like the details about the adulteress, for example, apparently never happened at all. So we questionable information at best. So, given my understanding there, and please correct anything that I've gotten wrong, because that's just my opinion of it as I understand so far. How would you address the list of archaeological whatever that this person has listed as far as evidence that the Bible is true?
Sure. So it's it's not like a super long list. So the mention of Noah's Ark, apparently. To be fair, I didn't. I didn't actually watch the video. I just saw your list. I didn't see that you sent me a link to a video. uh, but you gave me a list to go along with it. And the point number one was Noah's Ark. I don't know if you can correct me if I'm wrong, because
Let me help you. If you didn't watch the video, okay. He showed the Druipinar site.
Okay.
And that's his proof of Noah's Ark. Now, for those who don't know, the Druipinar site is like it's a tourist trap, in the vicinity of Ararat. It's a lot like if you were on Interstate 10 going through Arizona, you would see advertisements for the thing, and you would pull over into some curio shop to see the thing. It's much like that. So it's not Noah's Ark. It's a pile of dirt that is vaguely canoe shaped, and people from the Discovery Institute went out with one of these so-called self-proclaimed archaeologists to go explore the Druipinar site, and they realized that they were being scammed by one Ron Wyatt, and they left in disgust. And so if you want to check, Answers in Genesis will tell you that's not Noah's Ark. It's a pile of dirt, vaguely canoe-shaped, and the Noah's Ark would not have been canoe-shaped for a number of reasons. It was a box, not a boat. It didn't have a means of steering because it had no means of propulsion, so there would be no reason for it to have a keel. There would be no reason for it to be shaped like a canoe.
Right. So the thing is, that's not the only purported finding of Noah's Ark. There have been multiple. Sometimes it's mounds of dirt. Sometimes it's rocks. Sometimes it's something else that doesn't even resemble an ark. There are so many claims to this stuff, and none of them have been verified to be the ark.
And that's if we assume that there was a flood, because Answers in Genesis assumes that there was a real worldwide flood, and Answers in Genesis says that's not the ark.
Right, which is huge. If Answers in Genesis is even saying that. Now, furthermore, there was no global flood. And as you said in the beginning, yes, the closest we can get to is a potential local flooding that, for them at the time, if you're talking about, what was it, the Black Sea Basin? I think that's the Black Sea, right? Or is it?
Well, that one was, I think, if I remember correctly, that would have been 7,000 BC, and so that would have been like outside of even verbal memory.
Well, the thing is, if we're talking about an entire area that big getting flooded, that something like that might stick around. Sorry, my cat is awful here. Okay.
Okay, so granted, and there was, curiously, at the same time as the flood of Shuruppak that the Noah's flood is evidently based on, at the same time there is an impact crater in the Indian Ocean that has been dated to the same time, and I don't know if there can be a correlation there, but one would expect that there would be tsunamis from such a thing, right?
Sure. But then you might also, we'd have to find more stuff around the area, right, to show that maybe there was more flooding in other places too at that time. That would be something. So either way, there was no global flood. All of geology has kind of shown that that's not in the cards. So that's number one, right? And the second point here, Sodom and Gomorrah. And you kind of noted this before, how there is like this, some of this is based on cultural memory, right? Now, I think that the stuff in Genesis, especially in the primordial narrative, so that's Genesis 1 through 11, is primarily going to be mythic style propaganda. So it's mythology, but it was written, in my view, later, far later, like I'm talking like mid first millennium BCE here. So like around, the 500 mark. That's just a very round date. That's not giving you exact dates here. So the idea here is that, first of all, the Tower of Babel, that one is a direct polemical reference to the actual ziggurat. It's called the Tower of Babel because it refers to Babylon. It's very obvious. It's in the fucking name, guys. So we can date narratives like that based on little clues. And
just to help people out with this, that would have been Hammurabi's effort around about 1750 BCE, and he starts this massive ziggurat, but he never finishes it. And then Nebuchadnezzar picks it up, like, I don't know how many centuries later. He picks it up. He doesn't finish it either.
I think one of the interesting things here is that when it comes to the portrayal of something like the Tower of Babel, they have the theology kind of wrong, because in Babylon, it would have been the idea of making a ziggurat it wouldn't have been for the people to go up to the heavens. It would have been for the gods to come down. So they have the kind of idea wrong as well. But I should get back to Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Because that was the point. Similarly, that one serves as an etiological mythic narrative for things that the authors were seeing in their area. So this would have been like, part of the Dead Sea, and these vaguely human shaped salt mounds that existed at the time. And the thing is, they existed for a while. I believe Josephus even makes a reference to seeing them, and he even cites them as, makes a direct reference to Sodom, saying, hey, this is like where we have the event happening. So the thing is, they are not exactly like, they're salt deposits. That's the Dead Sea. Shocker. So it's these served as etiological narratives to explain just stuff that was around them at the time. And this was super common in all forms of both history and mythology.
So we're talking about some place that we're thinking that some little village somewhere, or a couple of them, were wiped out by, because I was read that they were wiped out by some kind of interplanetary impact, because what's more sensational than that? But it could also have been just a simple volcanic eruption. These are brimstone coming down. So, I mean, volcanoes go off. It happens. Cities get destroyed. It happens. But you're saying it doesn't necessarily even have to be that.
No, yeah, it's just an ideology. Like if you read through any kind of ancient Near Eastern literature or Greek literature, it's everywhere. They hide it in every single thing. They will like to explain customs. They like to explain places. They even sometimes do it with their own law codes, where they came from, their own systems. Like, it's etiology is a very common motif in the ancient world, because they're trying to explain where things came from. And sometimes they're based on like grains of truth, and other times they're just not. But it doesn't really matter to them, because I don't think this part of the narrative would have even been taken literally in the same way that we think of it now. Because the thing about ancient myth writing and ancient history writing, for that matter, is those weren't entirely separate. That is a far more modern idea, that one is fact and one is fiction. That is a modern conception. And when we are looking at ancient histories or ancient mythologies, we need to realize that the history contains mythology and the mythology contains history. It just was woven together that way, because that's just how it was. It was an entirely different culture around history, around historiography and mythography. It was an entirely different thing. And I think that the Genesis narratives, these early ones, are very much in that kind of mythic background to explain things at the author's time. Very much falls into that camp.
The next item on that list was the Pool of Siloa.
Yeah. So this one's a fun one, right? So this was you can call it a pool, right? Like a bath that was in Judea, and it did exist. It's a fact. We uncovered it. So there's a story about this blind man going up to Jesus, right? And he says, "Hey, first of all, he like weirdly like mixes his spit with mud, I think, and then puts in his eye, and then this is Jesus doing that to this man, and then he tells him to go wash it off in this pool." And the thing is, this was a very popular healing place. It's referenced in other Roman literature specifically, and it was just very common to send people to that place to get healed. And there is also an associated Siloam tunnel inscription, or Siloam tunnel, right? And that's kind of like served as an aqueduct, which would have been built by Hezekiah, and that is something that we also have evidence of. And once we get to it in Blasphemous Bible, I'm going to have a lot more to say about it. But that was an Old Testament thing. This is referencing a New Testament part of it. But yeah, this was a very much a real place, and it was a very popular ritual bath. It'd be like saying the Fountain of Youth today. So if there are plenty of takes on the Fountain of Youth in media, right? And no one bats an eye because like it just kind of has this legend surrounding it that is easily adaptable to a variety of stories. So this would be one of those things, except the Fountain of Youth. It might might be based on something real. I don't actually know, but
the analogy that I like to draw is, King Kong went to New York. We know New York exists. The Empire State Building exists.
Yeah.
So that means King Kong exists.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of that in these points.
Likewise, Spider-Man also swung off the Empire State Building in New York, so that proves Spider-Man too.
Yeah, something very important for understanding is that some verisimilitude does not prove the entirety. It just doesn't. So that is a very important thing to note there. But this was very much a real kind of healing spot. Right?
And this is the New Testament bit. So it was talking about real people and places, like questionable about the central character. I often make the thing about the Indiana Jones in the third movie of the trilogy, or when it was a trilogy. He goes to Germany, literally bumps into Hitler, and we know Germany exists. We know Hitler exists, so that means Indiana Jones exists, right?
Right. Yeah. It's a failure of because they're not even thinking of the stuff that does contradict it. They're only looking at the stuff that would support it. And hey, I'm all down for stuff. It's for building up a historical model. I'm all down for that. But we also need to realize that there is more than just the one voice. We need to also acknowledge the entire cultural context.
And then the next one on the list, the temple warning inscription in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum. Trace amounts of red paint have been found within the letters, indicating that the inscriptions once stood out in bright red. And that means Jesus had magic powers.
Yeah. So the thing is, yes, this was obviously a real inscription. There was a note about the non-Jews getting kind of kicked out of this place, and this is actually kind of a common thing in, especially, I'm not too sure how popular it was in the Roman milieu, but considering kind of the basis that Greek culture was for the Romans, I wouldn't be too shocked. But they would do this thing a lot where you don't really like talk about this in your Greek mythology courses, but Greek religion was in some cases it would be like, here we have this group that this cult site or this cult festival, and only this certain group can come to it, and then everyone else is just, you're not allowed to come in. So people in some group in Athens, right, they could say, people from this side of coming from like Ephesus or something, like, you can't come in, something like that. This was a very common thing there. It's here and there, right? this is sometimes based on politics, sometimes based on something else, but either way, there were like holy sites were often closed to like the maybe not often, depending on the size of the holy site or of the actual event, right? Depending on who it's for, groups even we would tentatively call like the same group, right? Like we'd say that it was all the Greeks, but even within that, they had certain tribal divisions, and they would, for certain occasions, have it be that the others can't enter. There was a sense of othering, and this is just another case of that. And yeah, again, we have like some verisimilitude, but it doesn't really matter.
So it's not like there's a secret that there were Jews at the time, and
Right.
and that Jesus was technically Jewish, although a heretic. Jesus would have technically been Jewish, and so whether if he was really magically endowed or if he was just some kind of crazy cult dealer, if he was, whether he was real at all, this thing would still exist, right?
Yeah, it would still
Okay.
exist completely. There's
Okay.
absolutely nothing that's indicative otherwise. So yeah,
Likewise, the next thing on the list, the Pilate stone confirms that Pontius Pilate was prefect of Judea. Was there any doubt about that?
no. We even recently
Okay.
found his signet ring, like the you'd stamp letters with. Yeah, so there was never any doubt about that.
Okay. Again, regardless whether Jesus is if Jesus was a first century faith healer and cult leader who really thought that diseases were caused by demons, um, let's say he was real and he was a wackaloon, Pontius Pilate would still have been the prefect.
Yeah, it didn't really matter which way you go with
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
And whether Jesus, the first century faith healer, whether he believed that there was a global flood, even though we know that there was not a global flood, he said there was a global flood. So that's reason to believe that Jesus is maybe not entirely on the ball, because we know there was no global flood. So we know more than Jesus did.
Yeah, and that time, they would have been taking those stories literally. So
Yeah.
yeah, he kind of falls into that array of people.
And then the next one on the list is an inscription found at the base of the Temple Mount that reads, "To the place of trumpeting," indicating that it had come from the place where the priests blew trumpets.
Yeah, so this is during the temple destruction, uh, where I think there's a reference in Josephus about that specific stone that the trumpeters would play from, kind of being thrown down, and
Mhm.
that's also fine. Um,
Can you
that's-
steel man that for me? Because I'm having a hard time understanding
so there's part of the temple.
how does that prove anything from the Bible?
It like maybe it references it. I don't know, but it doesn't really matter because this again, this was the fucking temple we're talking about here for a group of early Christians, but they would have been Jews at that time. Like, yeah, no shit, they would have known about this thing, and then also the place of destruction. Like, no
I
shit,
think you're just not giving the Bible enough credit. I mean, the Bible mentions the moon, for
amazing,
example. Yeah, and we know the moon exists. Therefore,
right? Yeah. Yes, yeah. I'm going to get into it a little bit later, but yeah, some verisimilitude. It doesn't get you to like if this is among the best that God could leave for people, like a pool nearby, that's not enough to to say yeah, Jesus was obviously he could obviously heal people through magic.
okay, well, how about this one then? The Nazareth Inscription, a first century imperial edict pronouncing the death penalty for anyone caught stealing bodies from tombs.
Yeah, yeah. So early first century is about as close as we can get with that. But there were tomb or grave robbing was a pretty common thing,
So
and
you're telling me that it was a pretty common thing that you would put a body in a tomb and then come back and the tomb is empty?
no. Well, I mean, well, grave robbing itself was a common thing, and they had laws against it for fucking forever in nearly every culture for a variety of reasons.
It reminds
So
me of my favorite road sign ever. There was a road sign that said, "Do not throw fish on the freeway."
yeah, so it's indicative of people doing it, fine, but this still doesn't get you to Jesus being God. And I'm gonna the premise
At
that
best, it tells you that more than once
sure, yeah,
people
fine,
have turned up missing that should have been there.
sure, yeah.
How many
And
empty tombs do we need?
I don't fucking know, but what the premise on things in the when it says there's no evidence of the Bible being true. Here's the thing: the Bible is a compilation of texts, and depending on the genre, things are going to be true to different degrees, depending on the author's theology, depending on their polemical goals, depending on a whole bunch of factors. They're going to be ontically true to different degrees. So a common thing in the Roman period, especially, you would have real historical figures talked about in like mythic ways. Julius Caesar himself, we know Caesar was a real guy, right? We know Caesar was a real person, but guess what? He had like myths written about him, like after his death, or even I think during his lifetime too. But like there was a story of him stilling the storm, or of stilling a storm. And what that is, the kind of meaning you're supposed to get out of a story like that is that he has like this divine providence, that God is on his side, right? That he won't get hurt during the storm. And we find the same motif when Jesus stills the storm. And they say almost the very similar things at the end of the stories, when he's like, oh my God, who is this man? Even the wind and the waves obey him. Basically the same thing was said in that story about Caesar. So this was a very common motif to get a point across. And the thing is, these were written about historical people. Alexander the Great has a whole bunch of them, written during this period, where you have this real person who we know did real things, and archaeologically we can even like line up a lot of them that we found, right? But then in some of these stories, they intersperse these mythic narratives, and that there were so many variations on this that they would be mutually contradictory. That is a very common thing in ancient historiography and in ancient myth writing. That's just a thing that happens.
So when they find when they find evidence of Galilee or Nazareth, and they're just finding the archaeological remnants of these, and they want to say that proves the Bible, my go-to argument is that they also found the city of Troy, and that doesn't prove Helen or Jupiter.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of this stuff that this is just how writing was at the time. It's an entirely different cultural context, entirely different outlook on how to write about the past.
Right, and then the next item on the list is, and this one I was again having trouble figuring out how relevant it is. This is the John Rylands Library Papyrus, P52 recto, contains parts of John 18:31 to 33, and it is the earliest New Testament manuscript discovered to date. Yes. And that sounds like it would be significant, except that apparently all the dates are somewhere to the middle of the second century.
Yeah, mid-second century. Yeah. Also, a great find. Great find. That helps us in textual criticism so much. That's really cool to have. Still doesn't get you to Jesus being God, right? But the whole thing, yeah, like I was saying, with the Bible is true, right? It's not just like one claim we're talking about. We're talking about a variety of claims in a variety of books over the course of 1,000 years. Like
and we're talking about something written 100 years after the fact,
right? Yeah, and even then, like it's not like an original. Like even if we had the original. Like, I mean, depending on how old it is, right? That may be able to tell us a lot, but we don't have any of those.
Yeah, and I have to wonder, what do you do with all of these others? I mean, because there's as Bart Ehrman mentioned, the 16, I think it was 16 different gospels that had to be tossed aside by human editors. No, we don't like this one. Jesus kills a kid in this one, and we don't like this one because Jesus is talking about how we shouldn't be circumcised. So let's just stick with the gospels that give the message that we want, and ignore all of these others that say things we don't like.
Yeah, the history of the canon is super interesting on its own. There is this great book from Lee Martin MacDonald. It's called The Biblical Canon, and it has a very good. It's not really. I mean, it's a pretty long book, but it's a very easy read actually. The essential argument is that it was a very organic kind of popularity contest. Like, here's a group of people that either accepts or doesn't accept a certain text as authoritative, and they did have debates about it. They were like, and I'm not talking like Council of Nicaea type stuff. I'm talking about like interfaith, like a very small community kind of thing, right? That would essentially, they would have arguments for and against certain texts, and ultimately they would just like decide, oh, this text doesn't really fit with what we believe is, the message or whatever. And so it just was like, well, this isn't authentic or something like that. And the thing is, it kind of exists even today, right? Where we see there are different church canons depending on which tradition we're talking about. So there's the Protestants, right? There's the Catholics. There's the Ethiopian canon, which has 81 books, including First Enoch. So and the first thing about First Enoch is it massively influential text, but it also has Enoch being the son of man. So we kind of run into some theological issues if Jesus was supposed to be that coming son of man, right? So it is interesting, but it's not really my decision how they deal with that. How they deal with it in their own faith is really up to them. None of my business, but it does have a direct contradiction with the theology of the New Testament. Still massively influential work.
I'm going to read the next one on the list. Is the Gallo inscription from Delphi, Greece, confirms Gallo as proconsul of Achaia and dates to the spring of AD 52.
Yeah, the thing is, there are other inscriptions for Gallo's position at the time, and they all generally fall somewhere into the year 52.
And there's no doubt that Pilate and Herod and Gallo, these were real people.
Yeah, absolutely. But the thing is,
but it doesn't tell us, was Jesus a cult leader? Was he God himself? Was he more than just one person? Was he not even a real person? It doesn't tell us anything.
Right, like a lot of this stuff that is mentioned, right, is often found within the Lucan works. So that would be Luke and Acts. They are generally believed to be written by the same person. They are technically more historical because there is a lot more verisimilitude, right? But the issue is, again,
Luke was Luke also in the beginning of the 2nd century?
Luke, there is it would have been in my view late 1st century, but okay. There is still some debate around it, somewhere around the turn of the century, but I would still be around 90.
So Luke then, again, way too old to have known Jesus.
Well, yeah, the thing is, these gospels themselves, these texts themselves, are all anonymous. These names were put later onto these works sometime in the 2nd century, because they were like, well, listen, we have the people alive now weren't alive at that time, so how do we ground our things? So they had their own method of, you could call it some early form of scholarship, where they try to tie in the gospels with certain authors. And, this is essentially the best conclusion they could come to. But they gave these names later to the texts to kind of, give them that grounding of eyewitness accounts and stuff like that. But the thing is, at the beginning of Acts, the author is telling you that he was not one of the eyewitnesses. He's telling you that he was getting his information from eyewitnesses, but he wasn't an eyewitness. And then most of the historical information is around Paul there. So whatever
But
source.
don't we get the same thing from Paul, where Paul makes these admissions that a lot of this is coming to him in dreams rather than real experiences?
For his conversion, right? There's the Damascus Road experience, right? But the thing is, even then, we have
what was that? A lightning strike? A stroke?
Well, whatever it was, he had some experience. Something changed his mind is the thing. So we have a historical Paul. Something changed his mind that made him convert. Great. 20 or so years after the death of Jesus, around there.
Where he heard a voice that none of the other people standing around him heard, or he saw something that none of the other guys standing around him saw.
Well, the thing
sounds
is,
to me like he either had a stroke or it was a lightning strike.
Of his actual conversion within the text itself. I believe in Galatians and the one in Acts just are not both. They can't both possibly be true together. It's one or the other. One does seem like an expanded version, but like the timing just wouldn't really fit. So, I mean, if you want to believe Galatians, that would be Paul's own words, or if you want to believe, the author of Luke Acts, it's up to. It's not up to, it's not really much up to debate, but it's very clear that the author of.
But you say if I want to believe, because this would be Paul's own words, but then aren't some of Paul's writings not really Paul's?
Yeah. Galatians is generally viewed to be actually a Pauline letter, though. So it's and that's mostly based off of textual analysis. But yeah, and dating the letters themselves is also very difficult depending on what we're talking about, because a lot of it has to do with like trying to line up the itinerary in Acts, and sometimes that's just off. Like sometimes it's just not possible. So something was lost along the way. Yeah.
So then the next item on the list, and then the last one is a big one, but this one's pretty big too. I mean, this is the heel bone of Yohanan, the son of Hakagal, a man crucified in the 1st century. The nail still embedded in his heel bone testifies to his violent death.
Great. We know crucifixion was a thing. Who
was Yohanan? Or
see, here's the thing. This I don't know the name specifically, but I do remember in L. Michael White's Scripting Jesus. There, and he kind of takes the approach of like, well, if this is like, let's say it's like a play, right? How are the authors constructing the play? So he kind of takes that viewpoint in analyzing the text. But I remember in that book, he actually has a picture of this, and it may or may not be of the same person. I don't know. But there is an actual picture of like, here's like some wood, and here's like an ankle essentially that's attached to this with a wooden nail, or with a nail going through it. So yeah, crucifixion was a thing, and that is how they did crucifixion.
So does the Bible mention this Yohanan, son of Hagagal?
I don't think so. Let me actually look that up.
Doesn't sound familiar to me at all. So I like you're saying, we know that the Romans crucified thousands of people.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And so we have some guy not mentioned in the Bible. I'm guessing there must have been, and because they're knowing the name, they don't tell me how. They don't tell us how they know the name. But I'm guessing there must have been some kind of inscription or something that was associated with this somehow. I guess. Who knows? But if it's a guy that's not even mentioned in the Bible, then how does this prove fuck all about the Bible?
It wouldn't.
And this is the big one. And you're going to do this one. When I saw this one, I'm like, I'm going to have to ask Lorence for this one, because they end with this note. That's this list of evidence to prove the Bible is also the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the Dead Sea Scrolls. Help me understand how the Dead Sea Scrolls prove the Bible.
Well, they give us a whole other set of textual traditions about the Bible. In a lot of cases, it's very similar to what we have. and in some cases it directly has different readings. Like the most pertinent example is obviously the one in Deuteronomy 32 8 through 9, where we have it being the sons of the gods, the sons of Bene Elohim, sons of the gods. So that would be a pretty big divergence in the text. So we're not just talking about one thing; we're talking about like a
A
whole variety.
multiplicity of things for which
Yeah,
there's only supposed to be one.
yeah, but even then, we're talking about texts that span around 300 years in their writing. So yeah, this is like, yeah, we have, like, no one was doubting
But that's just according to carbon dating, right?
oh, of course, yeah. Also paleography. So there's different dating methods or whatever. But either way, yeah, you don't get to jump to the conclusion that the Bible is true as like a whole statement. Uh, so I think, like I mentioned before, how a lot of these texts are, when people are writing them or when they're copying them, the things sneak in. They sometimes, and this goes for like other stories as well, that they would kind of add on to a mythos, or like take something out depending on the point they were trying to come across, and the point they were trying to get across, I should say. The thing is, we know that people like Alexander and Caesar existed. That's not really in dispute. Now, I think that we can say the same thing for a historical Jesus, just another one of the people claiming to be the Messiah running around at the time. Kind of
Again,
common.
a guy who thought that diseases were caused by demons.
Yeah, shocker in the first century. No, like the thing is, like, I am perfectly fine saying like, hey, there are historical references and some of them can be used to different degrees, but we can't just take the thing whole cloth and say, well, it's all literally true, because you mentioned at the beginning, yeah, there are plenty of contradictions between these stories, and that is a symptom of the way that generally like biographies were written at the time.
And
That it,
if we're only talking about the Hebrew Bible, we know that it's a compilation of stories that are 200 that were already 200 years old up to 700 years old, versions thereof, covering this 500-year period or thereabouts. Or am I getting that vaguely correct?
yeah, around there, yeah.
Okay, so we knew that these stories existed across the Jewish tradition, and then you come up with a compilation that would get the New Testament stapled onto it. Doesn't quite fit with the old books at all. But we just come up with a new kind of apologetics to try to reconcile for that. But I don't say where the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, so yeah, we knew that some of those stories had been around for a couple of centuries. It just that they're
Yeah.
still stories. Isaiah, in his many incarnations, could have existed in any one or all of them, and it still wouldn't. I mean, what would that tell you? That at most that there was at least one Isaiah.
Yeah, well, the thing is, yeah. So for Isaiah, the scholarship around it is in the same way, that we have like a very complicated history for the Deuteronomistic history, or for for Pentateuchal studies, and kind of the compilation. If we're talking about documentary hypothesis or supplementary whatever, any kind of debate like that also exists in the books themselves, because we have to realize that those bigger models are just a lot of little models put together, right? So the like Isaiah, the book itself, is generally thought to be written in three sections. So there's first Isaiah, and then there's also second and third Isaiah, but also known as Deutero and Trito Isaiah. And there is still the debate surrounding that. Now, what I'm perfectly fine saying is, hey, there was this dude who, I'll call him a prophet, but not because he has any actual prophetic ability, but because he was hired to be a prophet by somebody. Because
From what I read, Isaiah's prophetic ability was somewhat wanting.
Yeah, especially in the destruction of Tyre, right? That's one that's always cited.
Are we still talking Isaiah? That was Ezekiel, wasn't it?
Uh, was it Ezekiel?
That was Ezekiel who
The
said
prophecy of
that
Tyre, I
that
think that was in Isaiah, wasn't it? I'm gonna look that up.
no, it was Ezekiel who prophesied that was going to be the same guy in both of these, but it was supposed to be I forget the guy's name, but he was supposed to come in and he was supposed to raise or
Oh, right. Okay.
Raze. He was supposed to destroy the entire island city, and it was just going to be a bare rock, and nobody would even know where it was anymore. And that didn't happen. None of that happened.
Yeah,
And then
Ezekiel is a
later the
far.
same guy kind of admits that that prophecy didn't work. But this one, yeah, the same guy, and I forget what was his name. He was also going to conquer Egypt, and he was going to leave Egypt, the entirety of Egypt, a barren wasteland where where the foot of man nor beast would not trod for 40 years. And that guy, whoever the conqueror was, and I can't remember his name is off the top of my head, isn't that embarrassing? That guy died, never did any of those things, either of those things.
So yeah, I think it must have been Ezekiel then. So stuff like that, like wars, especially like what was it, was it the Syro-Ephraimite War? I forget the actual war, but the thing is, yeah, it was prophesied to last like, what was it, 70 years or something, and it only actually lasted for 12. So we have two different possibilities, right? Either you're writing after the fact, and the number isn't meant to be, taken literally.
It was supposed to be Nebuchadnezzar 2.
The second, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
That was the guy that was supposed to have done both of these things. And then the problem with Isaiah, getting back to Isaiah, his prophecy was where he said, where he tells that this is the biggest one that's quoted in Matthew, where they want to do the reference to the virgin birth, when Isaiah says that a maiden is with child, and by the time the child is old enough to choose honey over curds, you, my king, will know that your Syrian and your Palestinian enemies are no threat to you. And all of that was wrong. Just every bit of it was wrong. The maiden wasn't with child, so in order to fulfill his own prophecy, Isaiah knocked her up himself, and then forgot to name the child Emmanuel. It was supposed to be named Emmanuel, not Jesus, but Emmanuel, right? And so he named it something else, some ridiculous other name, and then what ended up happening was, by the time the kid was old enough to choose honey over curds, the Syrian and Palestinian kings came in and killed everybody. So every bit of Isaiah's prophecy was completely failed.
Yeah, the interesting thing about prophecy, right? Because there are two. What is generally accepted is like, it's called ex eventu, and that would mean like after the fact. So like, thing happens.
Say that word again.
It's Latin, ex eventu.
Okay, I'm just imagining Hermione saying that.
Okay, so the idea is that, so you have an event happen, and then after the event happens, you have someone writing as if they are writing before the event. So that's called ex eventu prophecy, and that was very
Hindu scripture. Hindu scripture actually contains the same thing. That's how they write their prophecies too.
That's how basically all of prophecy is written. There were some cases where it's like vague enough to be like, well, whatever. Like, the Delphic oracle would sometimes like have like prophecies, right? And for the most part, those were like very personalized prophecies. And honestly, you can't tell if it happened one way or the other, because they're so niche for like one specific person who had just like, given an offering or something. So a lot of not great methodology when it comes to that. But when it comes to the Dead Sea Scrolls in general, now of course you're gonna get a lot more when talking to Kip, right? Because Kip is like the Dead Sea Scrolls guy.
I invited him to have the hangout, but there was no way he could meet the schedule, so
Gotcha.
It's too bad about that.
Yeah. So I'm sure, he's probably typing away in the comments right now as we speak, just writing another dissertation about which is fine. Thank you, Kev. So
Yeah.
yeah, but the Dead Sea Scrolls, either way, they show you another textual tradition. That's great. That's great for textual history. But again, they don't really tell you all that much about the truth value of certain things, because a lot of it is just copies of other texts, and sometimes they change things, sometimes it's almost exactly the same. So
Okay, so after this list, what we come down to is there is still no evidence of the Bible being true.
in fact, this is kind of what I want to hit on before, but I was going to wait till the end of the list. So
We're at the end of the list now. We
right,
finished.
yeah. So when it comes to parts of the Bible being true, I'm fine with that. Most historians are fine with that. So what we're talking about is, kind of the nitty gritty, like it's not even nitty gritty, like the greater overall narratives about divine, divine things. So for that, we cannot have a historical methodology that proves divine intervention either way. That's just not in the purview of history.
Yeah, I fully accept that there was a John the Baptist.
Sure, yeah.
I don't know about, where he baptizes Jesus and then suddenly God shows up. A separate person, a cloud, a talking cloud, shows up and tells the Jews, "This is my son in whom I am very proud." I kind of doubt that part of the story. I
Right, yeah.
doubt that John the Baptist told his own followers that now you start following Jesus from now on instead of me. Because I've seen that's an appropriation, and I've seen it done in a number of different religions where they just tell the story about how the celebrated leader now tells all the followers to follow the new guy.
Yep. Very common thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the thing is, every text is propagandistic. Every piece of media is propagandistic. And the Bible is not an exception to that. It just is propagandistic. And the thing is, yes, you're going to have some historical truths in there. I'm fine with that. I'm more than fine with that. Sometimes I even, use, with what I do, I use it as like a starting point, right? But it's not me taking it literally all the fucking time. Like I have a methodology to be like, okay, which parts are true, which parts are false, how true are they, how false are they? And there's often a gray zone in many of these things. But when it comes to figuring out the truth of a certain thing, we also have to not just look for the stuff that agrees, but the stuff that also disagrees. So yeah, we talked earlier about how the prophecies get fucked up. Like they can just be shown to be wrong. In some cases, the text is very clearly just ideological. In some cases, it's like patently just something didn't happen, like a global flood. Now, in my opinion, that's not meant to be it wasn't meant to be taken as literal. But if you do take it literally, then it's definitely wrong, because there was no global flood. We know that, because a whole bunch of cultures just conveniently didn't, they just missed out on it, like it never happened. And then there's like even little stuff, like in Luke, actually, there is this part where they talk about like the signs that you're looking for and how to interpret them. And I think it's, what is it? I have Luke 12:54 through 56 pulled up here. So Jesus said to the crowd, "When you see a cloud rising in the west, immediately you say it's going to rain, and it does. And when the south wind blows, you say it's going to be hot, and it is." The thing about the south wind and it being hot, right? There are that kind of language is specifically more geared toward a place like Greece than it is Palestine, or first century Judea, whatever you want to call it, to avoid the all the political junkies coming at me. But either way, it's far more indicative of a place like that, because in Greece, when they referred to the southern wind being super hot, They were talking about this wind that, in their mentality, came from like from the Sahara Desert, and they still use that language in modern Greece to talk about how scorching the heat is from the southern wind. But it's not a language that you find in, like modern day Israel. That's the language that you specifically find in a place like Greece. So that kind of tells you about the location of the author and how he's imposing his own cultural milieu into the story.
I'm going to make a video about this soon. There was but the relevance in the 80s, there were a couple of different times when I ended up on TV news, not for anything big or important, but I end up on TV news, and the story was totally wrong both times. In one case, there were 3 different news agencies that were reporting the same thing, and they all get the same detail wrong. All of them. They give different numbers from each other, which made it even worse. But they're all wrong. And then in one case, I was at a medieval wedding, for example, and that was one of the reasons that I was in the news. Like I said, it wasn't a big or important deal. It was a medieval themed wedding, and the news carried it on TV. But the thing is that the reporters threw in all of this embellishment and speculation, just asserted, right, that wasn't the case. And I had to think, if you're supposed to be a reporter, it's not supposed to be biased, right? Why are you throwing all of this other stuff in there that nobody told you? You're making shit up, and that's not an emotionally charged thing. That's where you're supposed to be dispassionate about it, right? But then you get to something like the scriptures, where you have every bias amped up.
Yeah, it is ramped up a lot, right?
So it's if you can't trust the TV news on a mundane situation, then how can you prove, or why would you trust obvious sensationalism where everybody's trying to lie?
So, like, the thing with TV news and kind of how it is, right? They always want to drive viewership. Right? That's kind of the idea of a headline. It's supposed to grab those eyeballs, especially like in the modern era where it's click based. So there's always going to be some bias, and a lot of the time what you're going to find is there's a grain of truth to it, and the part of doing history is finding that grain of truth and then building a model that would explain all the facts that we actually know.
Yeah.
How do we go from this small thing to competing ideas about that thing? So it's about kind of working your way back and using whatever sources you have, and especially when doing like ancient history, we'll take what we can fucking get. So whether it's a reference in mythology, whether it's a reference in something biographical, something pseudo-biographical, doesn't matter. We'll take what we can fucking get. We just have to make sure that we contextualize the source.
Now, if there was going to be anything that would prove the Bible, that somebody's going to give me a list of facts and evidence to prove the Bible, one of those things would say maybe be a list of 500 witness testimonies, so that I don't just have to hear one person claim that 500 people saw a thing. Maybe 500 individual testimonies under different names, all compiled in some document in the possession of Pontius Pilate or whatever.
Yeah, but even then, you come with because there's this one. There was a whole thing about like the sighting of like Mary, right, or something like that. And I forget when it was, but that was like in fairly recent history, certainly in comparison. And
in Mexico.
Yeah, we have like a good amount of accounts for it. But the thing is, again, like in history, we can't assume like divine things. We can't assume that kind of stuff, because if we were to include that kind of stuff in our models, we would have to include it from every religion. And then let's say we accept something like the appearance of Mary, and like all the Catholics are super happy about it. But then if we started also accepting stuff from like the Delphic Oracle, or like the Orphic stuff, that we get a little, hints here and there. It's actually really cool. They're gonna hate that if we start including that in using the same methodology. Because
Well, we had multiple historians commenting on the Vesuvius eruption, and they were detailed, dispassionate, scientific, right? And you can tell you're reading. Somebody actually saw this thing, right? Just the way that it's written, and you can get just not that one guy's account because it's a pretty dramatic thing, right? We've got, and it's not just that we have the geological evidence and the archaeological evidence. We have multiple historians all writing about the same thing. So if we have 9 hours of darkness, I'm thinking maybe more than one person noticed that.
Right. Yeah. So like this would especially like let's go with the I think it's also in Luke's, right, where everyone is kind of like moving to their ancestral homes. We would have more accounts than just that of. And first of all, that's a horrible way to do a census. Second of all, we would have far more accounts of that. Worth like the fucking headache that would be, the amount of people just going this way and that. More people would write about something like that, a massive kind of like country or like statewide migration. Like we would have more.
And we're still talking about a minimal, right? Just a minimal requirement to have evidence to effectively prove the Bible. We would have to have somebody saw Jesus do something, and it wasn't somebody that an anonymous contributor to the Gospels decades after the fact. That maybe somebody was there and could give an account. If he's king of the Jews, why is there no documentation for this monarchy he supposedly led? That kind of thing. But anyway, I don't want to drag on about this. You've been extraordinary. Thank you so much for being on.
I wish I could have been of more help, because I always feel like it's never quite good enough when you're doing any kind of historical work. It never feels completely satisfying.
You did way more than this topic deserved. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.